In Legends of Runeterra, there are landmarks. These cards are played on a field and fill up a board space but are not units. They provide unique effects to get you one step closer to winning the game. Gamers, welcome to my Canadian apartment. My name is Corinne and here are my top 5 worst landmarks in lore that you should never use. I'll be basing my thoughts on a few rules. We will be basing this ranking on player versus player performance. You can use this ranking on Path of Champions, but truly, you can make any card good in that game mode. Scoring will be based on how well these landmarks fit in their designated decks. And finally, this is completely my opinion, you might have a different ranking than me, and that is a-okay. If you like this type of content, dropping a like, subscribing, and most importantly, a comment for the YouTube algorithm is always appreciated as it always helps. Anyways, without further ado, let's get started with the countdown. Starting off with number 5, we have the Paper Tree, which when you attack with a unit that has an attachment, grant that attachment +1 attack. While the effect is permanent, it's a small increase every 2 turns, and while it's a benefit, it's not impactful. And there are much better options to play on turn 2. And when Forge is a thing in the game that gives equipments +1/+1, Paper Tree next to Forge is very underwhelming. While it does buff attached units unlike Forge, you should not be playing attached when there are equipment in the game. My proposed buff to Paper Tree is a rework to only focus on attached units. We will do this by giving a new effect, making a 3-cost card, and if your unit has an attached ally to it when attacking, give the attachment +1/+1, and when the landmark is played, draw an attached unit. Attached units are very underutilized in the game, and it would be great to see some love for the archetype. Number 4, we have Star-Tipped Peak. A turn 2 card that does nothing until after the countdown, it creates 2 random celestial cards that cost 3 or less. If you compare this to the spell Super Cool Star Chart, which is a 2-mana spell that lets you choose what celestial card you want from a choice of 3, this is a delayed weaker version of that card that you need to use unit mana for. And with a pool of 8 different cards that it can pull from, it's super inconsistent if you need to get something specific like a Messenger or a Crescent Strike. And with it needing 2 turns before it does anything isn't great, especially for how fast the game is right now. In conclusion, this landmark is inconsistent and a tempo loss on turn 2. You're better off playing other invoke cards like Zoe. My proposed buff is to both increase the versatility of the card while also speeding it up. Increase the cost by 1 and change the effect to when summoned, create a 0-cost Super Cool Star Chart in hand, and upon the countdown, do this again. This way, there is an instant benefit from summon. In number 3, we have Vault of Helia. This is a 5-cost card with the effect of round start, kill a unit to summon another unit that costs 1 or more. Helia adds a lot of restrictions to deck building to make it work, and while there are decks that utilize Vault of Helia, it just becomes more of a challenge to make it work. This requires you to main deck units that are increasing cost, and if you didn't have a certain unit to sacrifice for a bigger unit, Helia can't proc. Say you want to get a Hecarim on the board. That means you have to sacrifice a 5-cost unit, but that's also bad because you're losing a 5-cost unit for a tutor. And it doesn't help that Helia is a 5-cost landmark, so you're summoning this super late into the game, where your opponent has more opportunity to remove your units. If I were to buff the Vault, I would change it to a 4-cost card, and also let it activate its effect upon play. In number 2, we have Spiral Staircase. This is a bad card that encompasses everything we talked about. If you play this on turn 3, you're losing tempo, and it doesn't do anything until the 3-turn countdown is finished. At the end of the countdown, you get Seed of Strength, a slow speed card that gives the ally +3/+2 and Overwhelm, but you better use this quickly because Seed of Strength is a fleeting spell. So that means you have to protect this landmark for 3 turns as it provides no value, make sure the opponent doesn't deny the Seed of Strength, and then have an ally to give the buff to the turn you have the seed. When there is Eula for Overwhelm and other cheap combat tricks in Targon, you do not need this incredibly slow landmark. There are many ways you can buff this card. Change it to a 1-cost, make Seed of Strength an equipment and not a fleeting spell, or decrease the countdown. Honestly, just do something. When Buried Treasure is a thing, this card needs to change. But that's my number 2. And before I say my number 1, here are my honorable mentions. We have Noxray Arena, which is bad due to it having a high cost, and it's in a region that doesn't support it. But if you pair it with a Fear unit, Rost, or Aatrox, it can be fairly decent, and there's some potential here. And Rockfall Path, which is a removal that gives your opponent a lot of time to respond since it activates 2 turns after it's played. But it's still a removal, and it does what it should do. But now for number 1. My number 1 is University of Piltover. Once played, this card is your deck. It discards your hand and gives you 3 random cards from a pool of over 300 different cards, ranging from very bad to good. You draw a card after its effect, but due to the landmark, you only have 1 turn to decide if you want to use a card or not, before it's discarded, thus making all your cards essentially fleeting. I can see this card working if you position Jinx and the landmark correctly, but outside of Jinx, discarding your entire hand is not ideal. With the entire pool of cards University can take from, there are just way too many archetype specific cards that could not work at all when separated from their designated decks. And over time, the amount of cards to choose from University of Piltover's effect increases, making this landmark worse over time. How I would buff it is to increase the amount of cards you get from 3 to 4, but that's why it's my number 1. But that's that. These are my top 5 worst landmarks in a game. Did I miss one? Let me know in the comments. Anyways, I'm Kryn. Don't do the illegal, don't play Yu-Gi-Oh! Alright, peace.